I'm Yigal Schleifer, and I'm a journalist based in Washington, D.C. For my project, I went to 3 different countries, each one representing what I saw as a different part of the European political experience. I went to Hungary, Turkey, and Ukraine. Hungary is a very interesting example because it's really gone from being considered a success story in terms of European democracy and nation building to a very worrying case. And this has to do with the rise of the current Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, and his party, the Fidesz party. They're a right-wing party. They've been re-elected several times now with large majorities in parliament, and they've used those majorities to pass all kinds of laws that have helped them consolidate power over the judiciary, over freedom of the press, over freedom of association. In Hungary today, and over the last few years, the government has increasingly been asserting its control over press institutions, especially, for example, the state-run TV, state-run radio. At the state-run TV news, I met one journalist who had resigned after he felt like the government and his bosses were increasingly interfering in the kind of coverage that they were doing. And it got to the point that he first had a hunger strike in front of the building of his old employer, and then he moved into a little caravan, a little camper that was parked in front of the building, and he just had a very solitary one-man protest where he just lived in that camper and every day would say hello to his former colleagues. When I was in Budapest, one of the big issues that was going on there was how is the government dealing with history, especially the history of World War II. One of the big points of contention was a monument that the government was building right in the heart of town. It was going to be a monument to what they said was all the victims of Nazi aggression. So that's not just Jews or other groups, but all Hungarians. And a lot of people thought that this was a misrepresentation of history because the government had collaborated with the Nazis. Turkey is another interesting example. It's a predominantly Muslim country on the edge of Europe. It's a candidate for European Union membership. They've always had what are considered very clean elections there, but they've had a government that's been in power since 2002, a Islamist nationalist party called the Justice and Development Party, led by Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He's become a very strong autocrat. Again, you see the same thing there, muzzling of the press, more restrictions on the freedom of protest and gathering, pressure on the judiciary, pressure again on the press. And you've seen a country that had a lot of promise in terms of democratic gains really erode those gains. When I got to Ukraine, it was half a year after the big protests that ousted the strongman there, Viktor Yanukovych. At the time, the center of town was still occupied by protesters. There were barricades with tires, there were men in uniforms, just civilians, but in uniforms guarding checkpoints. There was a big stage with lots of music, patriotic music playing. There was a general sense of kind of a chaotic euphoria and a sense of uncertainty. I think people at that time really didn't know which way the country was going. The new democracy was very much a fledgling one. My reporting there was actually then to look at what happens when one of these autocrats is kicked out and a country tries to rebuild its democratic systems after having to struggle with this kind of illiberal autocracy. At the same time, people were also learning a lot about what had happened during the time of this autocrat, and one of the most visible and vibrant examples of this was his estate on the outskirts of town. It was a kind of palatial Versailles-like estate with a golf course and a garage filled with collectible antique cars, and nobody knew about this place. It was kind of a black hole and when he left the country, suddenly this place was open and people arrived, and when I got there, it had been turned into a kind of park. I thought it was very representative of what was happening in many ways in this country, where people suddenly felt like, okay, a kind of a lid had been taken off, and now they were feeling a lot freer. There was a lot of uncertainty about which way this is going to go, and the big concern for many people was, where do the different political factions fit into this new future, and where do they fit into this new system? The lesson, I think, of places like Hungary, like Turkey, like Ukraine, is that we always have to be very vigilant. You know, democracy in the sort of the broad sense of as we know it is something that has to be safeguarded, that we always have to be very vigilant about leaders who in one way or another threaten to undermine democratic institutions, civil society, and rule of law.